The Inkwell and the Dagger. Chapter 1. Araluen Fife, the coast road, shortly after the Battle of Three Step Pass. Gillen sat on his horse and watched as Holt rode away, his grey-cloaked figure gradually becoming smaller and smaller and merging into the misty rain that had been drifting across the countryside all morning. The young ranger felt tears prickling behind his eyes. He shook his head impatiently to get rid of them. Holt had always been a grim figure, and his smiles were few and far between. But today there had been something intrinsically sad about his manner. Of course, Gillen realized, Holt had only recently insulted and argued with King Duncan, a man for whom he had always shown the greatest respect and admiration. And, as a direct result of that insubordination, Holt had been banished from the kingdom for a period of 12 months. On top of that, he had been stripped of his position in the Ranger Corps. Those two facts would be enough to drive a keen blade of sadness deep into Holt's soul. But Gillen sensed the real cause was something else, something within Holt himself. "He's blaming himself," he told Blaze. The bay mare pricked her ears at the sound of her master's voice. He shouldn't have sent Will to Celtica. He thought he was doing the right thing, keeping Will out of harm's way. Besides, if anyone's to blame for this mess, it's me. I should never have left Will and Evelyn alone in Celtica. There was no reply from Blaze, and Gillen wondered if she might be agreeing that the capture of Will and Evelyn by the Scandians and their subsequent abduction on a wolf ship really was his fault. He glanced at his horse, troubled, then decided that Blaze wasn't the blaming kind. She probably just had nothing further to add to the discussion. Holt's grey-green cloak was blending into the mist now, so that he was becoming harder and harder to make out. Then he reached a turn in the road and disappeared from view. Gillen continued to look down the empty road for a few more minutes, then he heaved a sigh and turned Blaze's head towards Castle Araluen. 15 minutes later, he caught up with Crowley. The Ranger Commandant was easing his horse along at a walk to allow the younger man to catch him. They exchanged dejected looks, then Crowley lifted his shoulders in a shrug. "Nothing to say, really, is there?" Gillen nodded. Already, they were feeling the absence of the grey-bearded ranger. Coming on top of the loss of Will and the princess, it was doubly sad for them. The Rangers were a close-knit group, but Crowley was Holt's oldest friend and Gillen had been Holt's first apprentice. They felt his loss more keenly than others might. The two rode on for several minutes, their horses matching step with one another. Finally, Gillen said, "He wants me to track down Foldar." Morgarath's second-in-command had seemingly disappeared after the final battle, but the Rangers were determined to find him and bring him to justice. Crowley nodded. "Thought he might ask you. I've got his files back at the castle. He made sure I had them before he went around insulting the king in taverns." He was pretty organised for someone making an impulsive gesture. You'd almost swear he knew exactly what he was doing. Crowley glanced sidelong at the tall young ranger riding beside him. "Oh, he knew what he was doing all right. Holt always knows what he's doing." Back at the castle, Gillen changed into dry clothes. He was staying in guest accommodations in Castle Araluen, and he had a small but comfortable apartment in the East Tower. Crowley's office and headquarters were in the South Tower, and to access them, Gillen had to return to the third-floor level of the castle and cross over to the South Tower staircase. He smiled as he made his way up the spiralling stairs. Like all castles, Araluen's stairs twisted upwards to the right, so that a right-handed swordsman trying to fight his way up the stairs would have to expose his entire body to the defenders above, while the defenders would show only a small part of themselves around the central column of the staircase as they retreated upwards. This had been the reason why MacNeil, the swordmaster who instructed Gillen from an early age, had been at pains to make his young student practice his swordsmanship with either hand. Gillen was very good with his left hand. With his right hand, he was an expert. Crowley's office was 3 floors up. Gillen knocked at the door, then entered in response to Crowley's call. The office was spacious and airy, like most of the rooms in Castle Araluen. A large window overlooked the expanse of grassland that swept away on a gradual slope from the castle. In the distance, Gillen could see a small village and the orderly squares of cultivated farmland. Crowley had changed into dry clothes too, and he was now sitting comfortably in a large oak armchair by the window, reading a report. The rain was still misting outside, but the wind was blowing it away from the castle, and, like most rangers, Crowley liked fresh air and light, so he had refrained from closing the wooden shutters. As insurance against the chill of the oncoming evening, however, a fire burned cheerfully in the grate opposite the window. "Take a seat," Crowley said, and gestured to another oak armchair, not quite as large as his own. Gillen sat, and Crowley glanced up from the document in his hand, indicating a pile of parchment rolls, each tied with a plain black string, on the low table between them. "Holt's reports on the Fulda business," he said. "Have a glance through them." He reached forward and took a quill pen from an inkwell on the table, made a notation on the paper he was reading, then continued to scan the document. There were a dozen rolls in the pile. Each one was labelled with the name of the fief from which the report had originated. 3 were also labelled with the word "closed." Gillen selected one of these and unrolled it, glancing through the contents. As he had suspected, the closed label signified that these were cases that Holt had investigated and found to be false trails. Fulda was known as a cold-blooded and totally pitiless killer. Confronted by a man claiming to be Fulda, people were more likely to hand their money over without resistance. Because of this, a host of Fulda impersonators had sprung up, trading on the man's notoriety to help them cow their victims into submission. The report Gillen was reading detailed one of these instances. A common robber, leader of a small band of outlaws, had assumed the Fulda identity and had tried to rob a wealthy merchant and his wife travelling on a forest road. Holt had intervened, having learned of the plan, and the fake Fulda was now reposing in jail. It was this proliferation of false Fuldas that had led to Holt's frustration. Each case had to be investigated, each criminal tracked down and arrested. The task could take a year or more. Unless... Gillen tapped his teeth idly with his thumbnail as he glanced quickly through another case study. An idea was forming in his mind. He glanced up at Crowley, still engrossed in the report he was reading. "Do you mind if I take these away?" he said. The Commandant looked up. For a moment, his attention was miles away. Then he nodded, understanding the request. "Be my guest," he said. "The fewer papers I've got in here, the better." He gestured to a desk in the corner, piled high with rolls of parchment, sheets of paper, and linen envelopes containing reports, requests, and other official forms from all over the kingdom. It was a mountain of paperwork, Gillen realized. He grinned sympathetically. "I'll take these off your hands then," he said. Gathering up the parchment rolls, he rose and made for the door.